So is this section group? Yeah, it is. Yeah, this is sponsored by.
No, but the ones that you come here quite a lot. So.
I think they're reading all of it, just as am I.
Hello to those of you joining us online. We're just waiting for everyone to arrive and then we'll start shortly. So get yourselves comfortable, get yourselves a cup of tea.
Hi, come in.
Hello, welcome to.
No. Thank you. Thank you.
No, it's all here. Sorry, I'm like talking quietly. Yeah.
Sit in the front.
Oh. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Very welcome to the Charles Dickens Museum for those of you who are here on site. And to those of you who are joining us virtually, very welcome to you as well. We're here today to celebrate a remarkable new novel called American Ending by Mary Kay Zuravleff, who is here with us this afternoon. It's a really fascinating book, actually. I was reading it recently in advance of this trip. And on one hand, it's set in a very specific time and place in Mariana in the early 20th century America. And yet it just felt so alive and it felt very relevant to today and, dare I say, very Dickensian. So here to have a little conversation about her new book and indeed how Dickens has helped perhaps inspire it is our very own author, Mary Kay. Very welcome to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm just so grateful to Jordan Evans Hill and to Sarah Ridley and to the Dickens Museum. And those of you online should come to the Dickens Museum in London. It's really a treat. It's a beautiful, beautiful house museum where he actually lived and actually wrote Oliver Twist and the Christmas Carol. Am I right?
Not
No,
right.
Nicholas Nickleby. Yes. So, I mean, that's amazing. So I am going to read from the beginning, and will you be able to see me read on the screen? Jordan and I are a team. And I'm really grateful that people are here live and people are here on Zoom. And I'm going to read from the very beginning of the book, just a couple of pages, because everyone says, why is it called American Ending? And why is there a wolf on the cover? Which, if you're here live, you may have seen that there's also my very own book jacket. I was serving as the sandwich board outside for people coming by. So a very good friend of mine who read this book in a serialized form, which we'll get to later, how Dickensian is that, said, I'm going to make you a banner. Welcome. I'm going to make you a book jacket. And I just love that pun. And also I love this coat. So I'm just going to read to you from the very beginning so you can hear the voice of the narrator. This book is written from the point of view of Yelena, who is her family's first American. She's in Mariana, Pennsylvania, which is a coal mining community. And this is 100 years ago. This is a little more than 100 years ago. This is 1908. And what's the most American trait that she could have? Well, it's to close the door behind her and not let anyone else in, unfortunately. So I want you to hear her voice. I hoped the sisters I'd never met would never join us. And when they did arrive, I wanted to send them back. That's how American I am. As far as I was concerned, my parents had left the two of them behind and come here to give birth to me. What do you want, a medal? My little brother used to ask. He was born here, but I was born first. Where I was born isn't how I was raised. Though I hailed from Mariana, Pennsylvania, I was brought up hearing that wolves talk and old believers rise from the dead, that a good woman can make soup from a stone and a good man's snot is black with coal dust. I'm American. So I figured I didn't have to take what comes the way Ma and Pa did. Our kind of Russian Orthodox is called old believers because they don't believe in making changes or choices. But I aimed to choose some things for myself. That included a life away from the mines, where most of the men who aren't crushed or gassed end up dead from drink. For years, I was at Ma's apron strings, pickling beets and cucumbers alongside her, boiling diapers, rendering lard for soap. Yelena, 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 she'd say. What kind of mother leaves her daughters behind? It was a riddle where the answer was my kind of mother. She didn't leave the family icon behind, or prayer books her father had copied by hand, or spools of brocade to turn any shirt into a shirt fit for church. She even brought over a tin of ashes scooped from their tumble-down hearth, given that every family has a domovoi who lives in the stove, and better the devil you know. A few plump raisins set out overnight and the domovoi would at most hide our slippers or let the fruit flies in. Each night, Ma uncoiled her braided bun and dropped hairpins in her lacquered box, painted with Emilion and his magic pike. She shook out her golden plates, never cut, because that was a sin, and carried them like the train of a dress into our room, letting go so she could hoist our stack of covers. She tucked the heavy wool blanket beneath our chinny chin chins and perched on our bed, careful not to sit on her hair. Rubbing her swelling belly, she asked us, Russian ending or American ending? Bedtime was the only time I felt sympathy for my big sisters, knowing that Ma and Pa had slipped away one day from Suwalki without them. It was hard to sleep stewing over that, and I worried that my parents might want to begin again. Every scrape I heard was the trunk being dragged from under their bed. Every squeak, the wagon carting them away from us. That was a Russian ending, and Ma's fairy tales were worse. For every wish come true, there was a catch, and you could easily end up worse off than where you started. She told us about the wolf who promised the bride a ride to her wedding if she climbed on his back, and instead, he ate her. Eyelash to toenail, Ma growled, tickling us three. My brother, Kostya, flailing to escape, smacked baby Pearl, who sprayed tears like a watering can. Russian ending, everyone suffer, Ma said, and soothed our baby sister. I'll give you American ending for my tender American children. She said tender the way the wolf might. American ending meant the groom slicing open the wolf's belly and the bride jumping out unharmed. Her baba skinned the wolf and used the pelt to line their firstborn's cradle. I heard it from the bride herself, Ma said. I danced at the wedding and I ate their soup. She was proud of the cheery ending she'd tacked on. Ma and Pa had come here to seek their fortune. And instead of Ma getting her girls back, she got me, then Kostya, then Pearl, and now another one coming. She hadn't seen her older daughters in 10 years. I didn't think we were suffering, but we weren't tender either. So I just want you to hear her voice. The entire novel is narrated by her. She's 9 years old at that point, and the book goes from when she's 9 to 20. So you've seen the cover. Let's jump right in. I'm just going to give you some context. I think. Do I point it at the computer?
I think it's just a bit sticky. But try again.
There we go. This is my father's parents on their wedding day. How old do you think she is? Little audience interaction here. Any other guesses? She's 14. And he's 18. And she had her first child at 15. And she had a child every 2 years, except for the year that she had identical twins. And my father was the 11th of her children. My father just died at Thanksgiving. He was born in 1931. Her name was Mary Zuravleff. This is my mother's mother, Kay Zuravleff. And this is growing up in Mariana, the mining town that I've been talking about. So, you know, we talk a lot about writers as, do you choose your subject or does your subject choose you? And I very much knew my entire life that I was named Mary Kay for my two grandmothers, Mary Zuravleff and Kay Zuravleff. But it wasn't until I was many drafts into this book and looking for a new agent that I was writing when my mother named me for my two grandmothers. Could she have known that I would tell their story? And I just got the chills all over again. I mean, it's so interesting how these stories find you. These are coal miners. How old do they look to you? How old does he look to you? Yeah. And he may be as young as 8. 10 was the guess from the audience. It's a very good guess. He may be as young as 8. He may be as old as 12 going into the mines. So do you see that bucket he's carrying? The bottom has a quart of hot tea. The next has some sort of lunch in whatever tradition you're in, a pasty, a pierogi, and then the top has dessert. And that hot tea keeps it hot. So that weighs a lot to carry that down a hill and then into the mines. And the saying was that if you were strong enough to carry that, it was time for you to go in the mines. During my grandmother's lifetime, Teddy Roosevelt upped the age. So now you had to be 10 to go into the mines. My grandfather went in at 8. And when that happened, they just changed their birth certificates. Poof, you're 10. This is Mariana, a bird's eye view of Mariana. My great-grandparents' house is the very top. And this is after the mine has closed. Nothing has replaced it. So the mine would be down here, the shaft, they would go down under into mine coal. And the reason why this is such an interesting picture to me, and it's described in the book, is that the people who lived closest to the mine actually had some mining experience. Brits, Welsh, Irish, Scots. It was a Scotsman who came to America owning the mine. And then you have stripes of ethnicities as you go up the hill. The Irish, the Italian, the Slavs, and the Russians are the last to arrive, and they're the highest up on the hill. Each stripe just is mean to the stripe above and mean to the stripe below. I mean, I said it's like Oxford versus Cambridge. Outside here, what's the difference? But there, big difference. So those rivalries run very deep. This is an actual image of the map of the mine floor. So I enlarged the shaft that my grandfather went down, and you can see they have carved an entire city underground. It's got railroad tracks and water, and each of these are cubicles that are then shored up, and they're hacking away at and setting off explosions and trying to get at veins of coal underneath the ground. Very dangerous, extremely dangerous, lots of cave-ins. And as they're setting off explosions and hacking into this rock, methane is coming out from between the rocks, and they're wearing a live flame on their heads. So explosions and cave-ins, it's sort of no spoiler to tell you in a book about miners that there's a mining disaster. This is a page of my great-grandfather's calligraphy. He copied the church services and the Bible in Russian. So the people in this book are old believers of the Russian Orthodox Church. They're called Stario Bratsia, the old brothers, old believers. And the language, the liturgical language of church is Slavonic. So it's not even Russian. It's sort of like Catholics having Latin services, but people not speaking Latin daily in the streets. So they're speaking Slavonic in church. He copied all the prayer books, but also an entire Bible. And I just love how it's sort of both elegant and sort of folk art, you know, very basic. And that my grandmother wrote on top, Sunday morning service, which you hate until you need to know what it means. And then it says Sunday morning service. So I grew up in Oklahoma. Has anybody here been to Oklahoma? Yay, yay. So it's very far away from Erie, Pennsylvania, where my parents grew up, or Mariana, Pennsylvania, where my grandparents were mining. There's only 5 of these churches in America. My first cousin is currently the priest of the Erie church. So growing up in Oklahoma, my mother really educated us about the church, which we participated in when we visited. But what's been really amazing is having family members who grew up in the church say to me, thank you for explaining the church to me, where it was their ritual. But to hear those prayers chanted in Slavonic, Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй, it's not necessarily to know that you're saying, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. And that's really interesting to me. Those rituals could be very important and moving and part of your life, but you don't necessarily know what you're saying. I got kind of constrained. My other books are so different from this. And so to write a historical novel based on my family's background and my and their religion and history. I know Teddy Roosevelt is president when Teddy Roosevelt is president. You can't make that up. And I'm used to making everything up. That's the joy of being a fiction writer. So I got kind of cross. I couldn't play with language the way I love to. Yelena's only 9. Her family is not, she gets up to a 4th grade education. Her family's not that educated and English is not their first language. So I kept feeling strapped by language issues and where was the joy? So I went to the fairy tales my mother read to us from, and this is an edition of an actual book she read to us from. It's actually illustrated by an Italian, which I thought was funny when I found it because it's the image I have in my head of a Russian fairy tale. But this is Ivan, which you might know from the Firebird story or some other stories, yeah. And this is Emilian, who I just told you about. She has a lacquer box with Emilian on the cover. So Emilian is this lazy boy. He's the laziest boy in his family, just wants to sit on the warm stove. And he goes out ice fishing one day and catches this pike. And the pike says, put me back and I'll do anything you want. So the rest of the story, he says, I ask it, pike, do it. And he has all his wishes granted. Well, that's kind of stunning to Yelena, who's boiling the diapers and rendering lard for soap. And, you know, the lazy boy gets rewarded again and again. And in the Firebird story, the wolf is trying to help Ivan get the Firebird and he just keeps being greedy. You can have this, but don't take that. He takes the golden cage. You can have the horse, but don't take the golden reins. He takes the golden reins. And, you know, as a 9-year-old girl following every rule imposed on her, those are not the most joyous fairy tales that she could appreciate. But it helped with the language, and so did the funnies, the comics of the time. She's an early reader. She wants the newspaper. They can't afford it. People bring her clips. Well, she's a kid, so they bring her the funnies. And this is a comic that ran in 1908. It's by Winsor McCay, who also did Little Nemo. Maybe you know that. Maybe you know Little Sammy Sneeze. It always has the same plot. Somebody eats a Welsh rarebit and they have terrible dreams, terrible, outrageous, vivid dreams. And this guy dreams he's been shot. And the doctor says, the missile entered his body between the 3rd and 4th fudgulus and is lodged in the blazaza. That's some language I can play with. And then this is Rube Goldberg. I don't know if you've ever seen a Rube Goldberg machine. He was famous for making these elaborate machines to do something simple like wake you up. And instead of an alarm clock, a boot would kick a pail of water down a hill, which would set a bird off, and the feather would flutter down and tickle you under the nose, and you'd wake up. That was a Rube Goldberg machine. But he also did comic strips. And this is a very simple one, Foolish Questions. You're loading a coffin into a hearse. Somebody dead? No, you chump. They're shipping a box of sandwiches to Egypt. 1908, in the newspaper where she lived. That is so sassy. She's not allowed to talk back. She's not allowed to answer a question with a snappy answer. That's very appealing to her. This is the church in Mariana, and it's not in great shape. It was built after there was a mining disaster, and many, many Russian Orthodox were killed. They didn't have a church before that. So what do? You build a church, and what does that mean? More people come over. You need the labor. And they actually were posting notices in the town square to bring people over. We'll pay your ticket. You'll have a job. You'll have a house. And that's why this family leaves daughters behind, because they only get one ticket, but you need a husband and wife to get a house. They can't afford to bring all the girls, so they leave their girls and come on over. This is the cemetery in Mariana where my great-grandparents are buried. This is an icon that is actually mine. So everybody gets an icon in this religion that's important to you and a link to the church. And this icon, my grandfather brought with him from Russia. What is now Poland. Where they're from is now Poland, but they would never call it that. That's the front and back. You can see it was previously attached to something else. I never saw what it was attached to. He gave it to my father when my father left home. My father gave it to me when I left home. And this is an actual literacy test given to young men who wanted to enlist in the First World War. So this is, again, another look at absurdity. look at the laws, look at the stories, look at the religion, look at the newspaper. And it starts out, do dogs bark as coal white? And your choices are no or yes, which already seems like a little bit of a trick, because we would say true or false. You would think it would say yes or no, but right away you have to be able to read no versus yes. And then look where it goes. Are scythes always swung by swarthy men? It's just absurd. Are intermittent sounds discontinuous? My very favorite. Are milksops likely to perpetuate violent offenses? Do you guys know what milksops are? It's a spineless person. It's somebody, a weakling. It's absurd. It's ridiculous. And then to me, it reminded me of some of the literacy tests given in America in the 60s when they were trying to register Black voters, and they would have literacy tests that were impossible to pass. And this is pretty tricky to pass. As it happened, the miners were declared essential workers by President Wilson, who was president at the time, and they couldn't even leave the mines to join the war effort. Not that that would be better, but it was not a choice they even had. This is the church in Erie. This was built in the 80s when the previous church burned down. And my husband and I actually got to help gold leaf that dome. It was plain when I went growing up, but I want to show you the interior, which a single priest painted. It's exquisite. It's just exquisite. These are the icons. So the icons in the church are stacked row by row by row. And you have to, women standing on one side, men standing on the other, and you have to stand for the entire service. So, which I learned in cathedrals, those pews are new, those chairs are new in cathedrals, and that's where the phrase going to the wall comes from. If you had to stand your rest, you went back to the wall. In this church, I would keep on my feet by watching these young men on library ladders. Each of these icons has a little hinged oil lamp, and they would come out and light every single icon. And then when they were done, they would snuff out every single icon. And that would take just about as long as a church service was, so that I could just concentrate on that. Standing up, more images of church in progress. It's very, very beautiful. This is my grandmother on my father's side, marriage license application. So Zuravleff is the name. It's phonetically spelled there, Zuravleff. Why you can't just type in your name into the computer and have your whole family history come up. But what I want you to see is Miss Mary Petoskey on this 6th day of August, 1908, in Erie. And it says that she is now of full age of 18 years. She's not 18 years. This is 1908. It's the age that you can be married legally. In 1910, she would be 16 years old. And on that census, it says she's 18 years old. And then 10 years later on that census, it says she's 26. So she's finally catching up to her age. But what was interesting to me was you hear these family stories just all the time. And maybe you have written them down or thought about them or put them together. But I hadn't really put their story together. I'm the youngest of my family. My dad is the youngest of his family. So I was often the kid in the room as they talked. And I really absorbed a lot of these stories. I knew both my grandmothers. And so I was already working on this book and thinking about it. But then you come to this notion of hearing something again and again, which was Ma lost her citizenship when she married Pa. So she's born in Erie, PA. He was born in Russian Poland or Russia or Poland, however you want to call it. And it turns out that American women who married foreign-born men lost their citizenship from 1907 to 1922. Oh, here it is on Jeopardy. Do you guys ever get or watch or hear of Jeopardy? So that's a game show we have where they give you the answer and you say the question back. Under the 1907 Expatriation Act, American women who married foreigners were stripped of this, I just told you, citizenship. The 1922 Cable Act gave it back. It didn't give it back. That's actually not quite right. It gave you the opportunity to apply to be naturalized if your husband had become a citizen. And this is the sort of smoking gun that angered me enough to get the catalyst to get this book out, which is seeing the 1920 census. Here is John and Mary. She's 26 years old. She has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 children at 26 years old. These are the twins. And we had a big brouhaha in America. You're going to ask about citizenship on the census? Do you have a census every 10 years? So you're going to ask about it? Well, it was a big fight because, yes, we need to know everybody and where they're from and for libraries and schools. No, a lot of times that information comes back to hurt people or is used against them. So in 1920, what they did was they asked, what year did you emigrate? He emigrated, and you can see it, 1905. And this means first pass. He submitted his first papers to be a citizen. She did not emigrate, so she gets an X there. But the next column is naturalized or alien. In my opinion, that does not apply to her. She was born in Pennsylvania. Naturalized or alien, in my book, she's a citizen. And you can see it says AL, alien. She has lost her citizenship. It wasn't anywhere on that marriage application. Nowhere does it say, excuse me, I need to tell you something. So that phrase that I heard, and maybe you have these in your family, Ma lost her citizenship because she married Pa. One day I said, what? What does that mean? And they said, I'm like, when? And I would say to people, I was writing this book, and they would say, that didn't happen in America. So that's another thing that we're talking a lot about in America, the sort of, and Dickens. So Dickens comes to America as a young man. He's not yet 30, and he's sort of done in by the paparazzi and American table manners. But he's very praising of America before he comes. He hates the practice of slavery. And then he writes, I'm disappointed. This is not the republic of my imagination. And I read that, I thought, join the crowd. This is not the republic of our imagination either. America is very aspirational and also ignoring the chapters that are not flattering to us. Yeah. So as I was writing this book, this isn't really part of the Dickensian story. My publisher of my first 3 novels said, I don't want this book from you. And then my agent said, you know what, this doesn't really match the book in my head. So I had to find a new agent and a new publisher. And so it was a great day when, after I had found an agent and she had found an independent women-owned press, that Oprah Winfrey, do you know who she is? Chose it for her spring book list. And that was a really wonderful day as a writer. And this is what they said about it. It's small acts of inventiveness, generosity, and love that keep individuals going when hard times close in. This is the wisdom and warmth of American Ending, which resurrects a community of immigrants from a century ago in magical, living detail to tell a story that rings true in the present. Zuravleff's fiery heroine, Yelena, is especially unforgettable, as she builds a life in a country that feels by turns inhospitable and rich with untapped promise. I love that. And I'm rereading Oliver Twist. Are you guys rereading Oliver Twist? Is that what you're talking about? So, you know, to write about the coal mines, and I was not, I mean, he was a bootblack apprentice. His father was sent to a debtor's prison. I did not live the miner's life. And he's writing in almost real time. And he's going right into those places. I found this little passage of going to Smithfield Market. Oliver's dragged there. He's sort of being tossed between Bill Sykes and Fagin. And there he is at Smithfield, from which latter place arose a tumult of discordant sounds that filled Oliver Twist with amazement. It was market morning. The ground was covered nearly ankle deep with filth and mire, a thick steam perpetually rising from the reeking bodies of the cattle and mingling with the fog which seemed to rest upon the chimney tops, hung heavily above. Countrymen, butchers, drovers, hawkers, boys, thieves, idlers, and vagabonds of every low grade were mingled together in a mass. The crowding, pushing, driving, beating, whooping, and yelling. He loves a good list, as do I. The hideous and discordant din that resounded from every corner of the market, and the unwashed, unshaven, squalid, and dirty figures constantly running to and fro and bursting in and out of the throng, rendered it a stunning and bewildering scene, which quite confounded the senses. That's amazing. Yeah. So that's a little bit of context for the book, and then we're going to get to talk.
Yeah,
Right?
brilliant. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we're going to talk a little. I might read a little more, and then we're also going to take all your questions. So feel free to come up with questions.
Yeah, Jean.
I'm amazed at
Right,
how
our
young he
cameras.
was when he wrote Oliver Twist. Oh my gosh.
24 years old, isn't it? Amazing.
4 years old.
That makes us green with envy. I'm
It
sure.
does. It's just incredible. Thank
Thanks.
you. Thank you very much.
I mean, it is just such an incredible book, though. And you know, I really love, I don't know about anyone else, but I really love historical fiction that does what you do. I often find when it comes to historical fiction, you know, particularly in Britain, it's always the Tudors, it's kings and queens, it's earls and duchesses. And what I love is when you just get that really earthy, this is an ordinary family living amongst extraordinary times. And actually, there's all these legal changes and there's things going on in the wider world, the First World War in your book. But it's just those ordinary reactions to them and their daily lives and how they're impacted by shapings that they don't really control. And I absolutely love that.
And in fact, one of the reasons to do that is not finding their story on the bookshelf. So the Tudors have been well documented, and there are many, you know, lives of famous people. And so I'm looking on the bookshelves to see, where are my folks? And Toni Morrison, our wonderful novelist, Toni Morrison, says, if your people aren't on the bookshelf, you have to write that book. Yeah. So that was amazing to go then and talk to the people in Mariana and in Erie, and be a little bit nervous that they might say, not who are you to tell this story, because it's definitely my family, but you got this wrong, you got that wrong. We talked a little bit about research. And it was such a joy because in both places they kept saying, you saw us, you captured us. And in Mariana, they were saying, I'm not Russian, but I lived next door and we called her Baba and we ate her blintzes and her skunts and we celebrated. And your great aunt once gave my great uncle a ride, and it made all the difference in the world. Like these acts of generosity and inclusion and community that were really exciting to hear. And then one man said to me, did your people ring the church bell? Because I live next to the church. So his association wasn't as positive.
Yeah. But that was really beautiful. And actually, I remember reading the book again, and this is what when I did the introduction, talking about this idea of it's set in a very specific place and time, but actually it kind of transcends that. And actually, particularly with your characters, I very much felt you recognize these characters, even though they're, you know, burly Russian miners, and of course, I don't live in Mariana in these Orthodox communities, but you really feel these characters are real. You recognize the personalities and the traits. And I wanted to ask you a bit about how much you wanted to kind of take on class, because I think class is a huge thing in your book. And what you really get a sense of as Yelena goes through life is her almost confronting the reality that she's poor. And it's almost like she doesn't really quite know it to begin with. But then the more she grows up and the more she goes into life, she starts to feel what her place is and really gets quite angry because she wants more, understandably.
She wants a choice. And she is in a life that has no choices. As a young woman, in this religion, in this community, she's expected to leave school in 4th grade. When her sisters finally come over, they can't feed those 2 more mouths. But what do? They marry them off. Now she's responsible for helping to take care of their children. And so, she so badly wants a choice in her own life. And that word isn't even in their vocabulary. Yeah. So that was something that I really struggled with, because you could write that from a 21st century perspective, where you're kind of judging and pointing out again and again, why not? Why did they treat? But I'm so glad you said what you said. And I take that as a huge compliment, because the goal was just to have her in it. She doesn't have to explain her religion. it's her religion. It says, it's like explaining my left arm to you. And likewise for the town, this is where she was born. And she wants people to see her as American. Nobody sees her as American. And she thinks one day, oh, well, I go to a Russian Orthodox church. I live on Russian Hill. And, my parents don't speak English very well. Of course, they don't see me as American. But in her head, she is American and she should be treated. She should be seen that way. She's not even seen, really. Yeah, that was so hard to not explain and just live it. A friend of mine said after one draft of many, people in historical novels don't know they're in historical novels. Oh, darn. Because that's such a great point. Yeah, so to try to stay out of my way. But also the timeliness of it. I'm writing about immigrants who have been brought over for hard labor, dangerous labor, and when they're killed, they just bring over more immigrants for that job. And they're kind of dissed in every which way. You probably know the phrase, "owe my soul to the company store." So they're paid in scrip and not cash. My mom's mother marched into the foreman's office and demanded that my grandfather be paid in cash because she was not going to shop at the company store. So they want to try to get out of there. There's no way out. Who do they belong to? Are they allowed to leave and get a different job? And I'm typing this, and then here's the pandemic coming down the pike in 1919, and I'm typing this, and it's 2020. And instead of 1919, I type 2019. And I just leapt back from the keyboard because so much of the discussions we were having about refugees and immigration and what was fair and the census were exactly the same conversations they've been having for 100 years.
Once you make that discovery, then did you kind of consciously go down that road of sort of trying to draw links with modern America, or was that more of a subconscious?
You don't have to consciously. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to. One interviewer said to me, "It seems like you are your grandmother's American ending." Like, oh, I love that, because I had the luxury of going to college. I had the luxury of saying, I'm going to be a writer, which would be ridiculous in her generation, right? She didn't have the luxury of going to 5th grade. So my parents thought it was absurd to study the arts. That would just, practice as an artist, because that wasn't their reality. And so that luxury was not present then. Yeah.
And it's really, I have to say, those themes I just felt were utterly Dickensian. I really got a sense, particularly when Elena's young in the story at the beginning part of it, when she's only a sort of child, you almost feel that sense of Little Oliver Twist, or Dickens's book Gone Astray, where he kind of gets lost as a child and he's kind of going to take on the big city, and he has this sort of almost childish hope that isn't going to come true because he's a little kid lost in London. But you really felt that sort of Dickensian sense of here's this kind of plucky heroine who wants to take on the world despite the challenges.
Despite. And as an author, you don't want it to just be one horrible thing after another. And so there's family, there's church, there's food, lots of food, there's tradition. And all of those things bring about joy. At one point, the mother says, we're just like the Pilgrims, because they're learning about Thanksgiving in school. Pilgrims come over here, they're already in debt. They're already dying off at a fast clip. And they leave because they can't practice their religion. So the Jews are treated horribly in Russia and Poland, and the Russian Orthodox are treated the next horribly, and all the priests are killed at one point. So they consider themselves persecuted, and so they open their house to have a Thanksgiving, and they don't have a piece of bread to eat. So to have Thanksgiving is a big darn deal, and it turns out that everybody kind of shows up at their house. Oh, here, I have some cherries I canned. I had the stone soup story. The community really contributes. You're having a teacher over? Oh, okay, I can bring you this. I can bring you poppy seed cakes.
I love that scene, actually, the Thanksgiving scene. And I felt that really reminded me, again, of Dickens, because Dickens, as we know, uses food. Food is not just a thing in his stories. They have such significance to the emotional sense of the character, the class position of the character, and I just felt that was something that you really did play with in your story. Again, was that quite a conscious choice to?
Well, yes. Food is such a part of our tradition, and I've loved people saying to me, oh, my family, not coal miners, not Russian, but Chinese, and the dumplings my mother made. And that, what a big deal this holiday was. And then the next person comes up and says, oh, in my Jewish family, we have, oh, you call them pierogies, we call them, there's sort of an equivalent. Blintzes are the same as crepes, are the same as tortillas, almost. Tortillas aren't sweet, but blintzes have a little bit of sugar in them. And so, everybody's got that portable sandwich for the worker. And then I was reading the book aloud for the audiobook, and my sound engineer was a young woman who was of Polish American descent. And after the first chapter, she said, oh, you're making me so hungry. These are all the foods we had growing up, with just a little bit of a difference. So food and smell reach so far back into our past. Yeah. But then also, these people are just about starving. And that's a link to writing fiction versus nonfiction. They keep Lent 6 weeks before Christmas, 6 weeks before Easter, every Wednesday and Friday, and every Saint's Day. And Lent is no milk, no meat, no dairy, no eggs. And I was writing that, and I was thinking, oh, well, they don't have that often, not during Lent. I wonder if they made some of those rules to turn this sort of, poverty into piety. And I called my mom and I said, I just had this. And that's the difference between writing fiction, where you get to reflect on it. And my mom said, I bet they did. I bet they did make that rule. So that was really interesting. People said, why didn't you write it as nonfiction? I wanted to combine the two families because it was too many people moving around in time. But I also got to ask those questions that when you're in it, you don't ask. It's just your life.
That's really interesting. One of the other things that I loved is you have this plethora of characters, and some of
many fewer than we started with.
Yeah, well, that's actually what I was going to ask, because some of them, might only come in and out of the story for maybe a couple of pages, but they have got such a strong presence that you can't forget about them. And this is such a Dickensian trick.
That's so Dickens. That's just so Dickens. He's brilliant at that.
From him, you've got kind of Miss Flight in Bleak House, or you've got Miss Wade in Little Dorrit. These are characters that are not necessarily the main characters, but they kind of, you can't forget about them, and you're drawn to them constantly. And so they cast huge shadows over the narrative. And I have to ask, how much time did you spend writing backstories for all of your little characters?
Well, many of them didn't get as much time on the stage as they had in earlier drafts, and many people were voted off the pages because it was a lot of people, and the names were throwing people, the Russian names, and everybody has a nickname. So I had a running gag. Olga is a very popular name because she's the big saint, and you get a saint's name. So at one point, Elena had two friends named Olga, the two Olgas, and I really got a kick out of that, but nobody else was getting a kick out of that. So there's some things you do for your own amusement. But Dickens is just brilliant at inventing the comic character, the evil, mean, sinister character, and then the through line. Who is this person that keeps popping up every 3 chapters, and why are they important to this book? And I saw the locket, and I saw that, oh, what's going on? So the piquing your curiosity character, who's vivid enough to keep in your head, but hasn't shown their worth in the narrative yet. I love that. So it's like a mystery. And so I have to say that I would go back to that. Like, how did he do that? Because you don't just want them to be stereotypes or caricatures. And there's a young woman is sent with her sister's name, Shenya. And Shenya's, in my mind, very vivid. And she will tell Yelena the true answer to questions that Yelena will boldly ask her. So that's valuable. And then she moves away. And when it's time for Yelena to try to get herself out of Mariana, you think, maybe Shenya will help you. And so you get that opportunity to bring her back and have her be a continuing influence in her life. And that was fun. It's like, let's call on her. And this is something I wanted to talk about. So I'm glad we got here. As a young reader of Dickens and a new writer who wants to invent and have a giant cast, sometimes his work seemed way too coincidental. Oh, all of these ridiculous opportunities that are going to make themselves known. And then I've come to so appreciate them. And we've been here a couple weeks. So one day we go out to tea at the beautiful Theatre Royal. And there are two gentlemen obviously celebrating something. There's flowers there. And so at one point we strike up a conversation as we're all leaving. And darn if he doesn't live in one of the houses that Charles Dickens lived in, and he got the plaque for the house. And that's just a Tuesday, that's just a day in London meeting a stranger. And then we're on the train and we take over a table for four that one man has sat in, and there's three of us, and sorry. And he says, no, I love your American accent. Where are you from? He's very friendly and sweet. He's a magician who, as it happens, performed in New York once, and his friends took him into Trump Tower, where he ordered a couple coffees, and Donald Trump walked over to him in 2010 and said, I love your accent. I'll buy your coffees. And we said to him, you could have done something in 2010 that might have scared us. But I mean, that's a crazy coincidence. Three Americans get on a train in London, and a magician tells them he met Donald Trump before he became president. So then you think, wow, and in this book, her parents come from all the way from Suwalki on a train, on a boat, then on another train, then by cart. And the house they're shown is attached to neighbors they had in Suwalki, who they did not know were here. And the Americans say, small world. The Russians say, the world is cramped. Same sentiment, but Russian.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a few more, but I mean, does anyone here want to ask a few questions before we carry on?
Yeah, we'd be happy to hear from you.
Too much pressure. That's fine. I'll ask a few more. Don't worry. Throw up your hands if that's all you want to ask.
And then we're going to open the chat too, right?
We are going to open the chat as well.
We hope there's some questions there.
So I was going to ask another question. Obviously,
can they see us?
They should be able to.
Good, I hope so.
But one of the questions I wanted to talk to you about was about the role of religion in the book, because it's quite fascinating. Because Yelena, again, she's just such an interesting character that you've created, and she's got this she's not irreligious at all. She's very sincere in her faith, but at the same time, she's quite questioning of the structures of it. The priest kind of tells them to do things, but doesn't really explain why. And she sort of thinks, well, why doesn't he just explain things to me? And I thought that was really interesting. It was very modern, but at the same time, it kind of chimes with a lot of Dickens's own relationship with religion, where he kind of is religious, he goes to church, he's a Christian, but he's very critical of the church at other points where he feels it's failing to kind of help the poor. And I just wondered, what was your kind of reflections on the role of the church, as it were, as you came to write the book?
Yeah, it was complicated because I was raised in it, but not there. And I was not trying to diss the church or in any way show it in a bad light. And yet it's a very fundamentalist religion with a million rules. It is a house built of rules with no logical reason. It's religion, it doesn't have to be logical. And there are things like, well, you cannot smoke because your body is a temple and you wouldn't want to harm it. But you can drink, because the first miracle was turning water into wine. And so, it doesn't really make much sense. And women can't cut their hair, but men can, so it goes on and on like that. And Yelena is bright and vivacious and loves to learn. And she keeps saying, but how come? But how come? No, you don't. And that's another interesting thing of people saying to me, thank you for explaining some of the church to me. If you don't even know the language of it, we do this because we do this. And we do this because in some ways, in all ways, the church united them. You help out other people in the church. They didn't starve because of the other people in the church. And so it was a great help and a comfort in a lot of ways. But it also told you who to marry. And it also told you that, oh, your son is now this old. He goes into the mine too. That's not religion, that's family. And boy, are they intertwined. Who does what and why. Yeah, the religion doesn't say you marry at this age. The religion doesn't say that. And yet it begets that.
And it's that sense of almost, again, it kind of goes back to our conversation earlier about power, doesn't it? I thought, again, Dickens writes a lot about where there is hypocrisy found within sort of positions of authority, particularly within the church. And I thought it was really interesting with the priest in that town, where, obviously he's this huge authority figure, and yet they found out halfway through the book he's not even a real priest. And actually he has to then be rededicated as a priest. So again, you capture that sense of...
Yeah, and she's thinking, you've been telling me what to do all this time, and you've been punishing me. She's just had her first confession, which is not a pretty sight. And, they're held accountable for everything. Oh, did you ever steal? Confession is the only thing that's been in English so far, except for Sunday school. No, I'd never steal. You didn't take a crumb off the table. You didn't take an extra piece of bread when your mother said enough. All right, add it to the list, So he's just dealt out this punishment to them through confession. And then she discovers he's not even a real priest. So who's the one who's a liar here? Yeah. So who is making these rules? And that goes for the country, and that goes for the church and the community. So and the family. Who is the entity that is taking all her choices away? And how is she going to be able to have any voice in her own life? So one interviewer said to me, oh, she's so rebellious. And I said, no, she isn't. She does every single thing that's expected of her. But she's trying to figure out, in this system, how could I have some voice, which women have been trying to figure out for years and years and years. Yeah. I don't want to be ostracized from this family. I don't want to be excommunicated from this church. And yet.
And that's, again, really interesting in times. I mean, I know there was, we spoke at the museum recently about Dickens in the 1830s. There was a movement to close down anything basically that wasn't work on a Sunday. And of course, the upshot of that would have been that poor people couldn't have gone and done anything on a Sunday. They couldn't have gone out for dinner. They couldn't have gone to the restaurant.
Their only day off.
Their only day off. They worked the rest of the week. And so Dickens was scathing about this and wrote, several articles condemning it. One of which I have to say was brilliant, because he actually wrote it effectively to the Bishop of London, and sort of got quite cheeky about it. So again, in that sense of, they're not trying to overthrow the world order, but they're trying to question it and think, actually, let's focus on people like, poor people growing up, wanting to do the right thing, and let's do the right thing by them as well. So.
Well, we went to the V&A, which, what's more beautiful than the V&A? And they have those dining rooms for the working man, which were open later and are exquisitely decorated, William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones. And, the working man should have beauty. The working man should, and I've been working in museums. I worked in the Smithsonian for years and years. And, there's that threshold about who is this for and what times are you open and who can get there. And so to open the V&A late and have these beautiful, I found it very moving. I was really touched.
So final question for me.
Yes.
Obviously, we know, because of people like Dickens, that literature does have this incredible ability to change perceptions, to change hearts and minds, to have an impact in the world. What do you think about literature generally, and what do you hope people will get after reading your book?
Well, I sort of feel like literature is my religion. I mean, it's so important to me. And, I think of Dickens as writing, shining a light in places where people hadn't, the plight of, as you were saying, classes who had not been given their due or were really put upon. And in this book, both letting these folks be on the bookshelf, but also hearing people say, I have to tell you my family story. I have to tell you what they went through. And by way of example, there was this young man who interviewed me whose grandfather, unbeknownst to him, had snuck in from Mexico. He'd been raised in a very tony suburb of Washington, D.C., and his grandfather was a surgeon. So he did not know anything about this. But before he died, his grandfather said, I have to tell you this. And about where he had been excluded and how. And Max was really moved. And I was saying to him, isn't that interesting that you never knew it? Your grandfather could have gone to his grave. There's no shame in his story. And yet he felt shame and still did not want to go to his deathbed without telling. And that mix of like pride and shame, I have to tell you where I came from. And don't forget this. I mean, that's just fascinating to me. And that has been the offshoot of sharing this story with others, is people saying, oh my gosh, I'm going to go home and call my grandmother and turn on the phone and record her. Or I'm going to look into, or I know that these folks are from here, but my husband is a genealogist. So we've been kind of a tag team to reading groups that have said to us, this has really made a priority of capturing our family's particular struggle. Or, like I said, amazing acts of generosity. Some of the stories are just incredible. My grandfather had $1 and somebody did this for him and it allowed him to stay or get married or, yeah. So that's been, I guess the power of this book for me has been actually hearing other people's stories and begetting other people to capture them.
That's really beautiful. Well, thank you so much. If there are any questions from the audience, I'll just go and check our online guests.
Maybe there's a question waiting for us online. Yes.
But I was sort of thinking, in Dickens' time, the way to shift anything was through the arts, through poets, particularly, for things like The Fallen Woman, and for workhouse artists. And you know, they were out there supporting, they were out there for anyone else. So actually trying to shift things in Parliament, etc., and get acts through. I was just thinking at the end, I was thinking, so really, you know, Yelena is, how is she doing it? And I simply thought, look, actually you've done it through art, because you've done it. So it is art that's actually put it out there, and of course all the other contemporary people right now to start thinking and waking up and saying, oh, I have to tell this about my family.
I love that. Thank you. I love that. Yeah. And I even saw that Dickens, you know, dedicated the Pickwick Papers to the MP who was trying to change the copyright laws, which is a whole nother, that's the put upon of authors as opposed to, yeah. So, you know, artists often do shine a light on the plight.
Yes.
Yeah.
And was the driving force behind a lot of Dickens's work.
Yes.
So, was Dickens an influence on you as a young reader or writer?
Well, we read A Tale of Two Cities and Oliver Twist young. And A Tale of Two Cities was, I mean, I remember that just being riveting. And I was thinking about that now in terms of, I have not been a historical novelist before this book. And I was thinking the time shift, his looking back, I'm looking back 100 years. It's not as great as that. It would be like me writing about now the 1950s. Isn't that wild? Yeah. So, but I remember reading and thinking, you know, it was so long ago. Yeah. And also that what you were talking about earlier about being so inside each character that it justifies whatever strong feelings of justice or hate or, you know, so Madame Defarge saying, I'm sorry, but you're still condemned because, you know, that she's a villain, but she's also a heroine. There's no, and I remember being confused by that. I think that might have been the first time I was old enough to read. We were talking about this the other day about when you read it and how old you are and who you identify with. And so to say, but like, I think before that, what we read had been simpler, and Dickens complicated my my reading life. Oh, I want to say this. I have a very, very good friend that I grew up with who was just an unbelievable reader, uncensored, read every single thing she could get her hands on. And during COVID, I was drafting this book and she was diagnosed with breast cancer and she is perfectly fine now, yay. But at the time, she's such an optimist. Well, it's this big, so they're going to operate, yay. Oh my gosh, that's terrible. But she lived a couple 100 miles from me and I would in a different time go to her, bring soup, walk the dog. What could I do? I couldn't do it because COVID kept me from it. So I said to her, do you want to read my book in serialized form? Yes. She said yes. So I literally mailed her a chapter every week and she would take it to chemo and read it while undergoing that horrible procedure. And then I would get these real-time responses, you know? And then my good friend, Sarah Ridley, who helped invite me here, said, wait a minute, someone's reading this book and it's not me. So I said, you could join the elite subscription service of 2. And I began emailing Sarah chapters and she was reading it in real time. Turns out her great grandfather was a miner, obviously not in America. And And so she was telling me stories of that, again, not Russian, not America. And then one friend called me one day and said, do you have to be sick or suffering to read this book? And I said, no, you could join. By now we had gotten up to 6. You could join the elite subscription service of 6 people. And so that he could serialize a novel, sending out the beginning and not really, it seems to me, knowing where it was going. I mean, we say as novelists, you're flying the plane as you're building it, but he was really flying the plane as he was building it. And then that also goes back to my talking about coincidences. When I teach people, I teach a lot of novelists, and the tendency is to keep throwing that net out. And did I mention? And I brought another 6 people in. And I will say to them, no, let's go deeper rather than wider. Go back to where you started. Everything's right there. Let's see what's going on that will resonate through your book. And I think, that's exactly what he was doing. Just go back and say, is he really an orphan? Is he really, was his mother really? So I found that I really appreciated that too. That wasn't the question, but
No, it was really.
But I answered a different question.
Well, fantastic. I know that we're running very short time, so we'll probably have to end it. But I know just before we do, you're going to give us another short reading.
Yes, I would love to. This was that Smithfield Market scene. Here's a very short scene on a day. As I said, it's no secret that if you are talking about mining, there's going to be a mining disaster. And so this is a morning after that big Thanksgiving feast, a couple of days later, just 2 days later. The mother is very pregnant upstairs resting, and it's been snowing. Let's see. First a snow day, and now a morning without grown-ups. I poured milk in a pot, and Kostya toasted bread for milk toast, a rare treat. I brought down a stack of comics, and Pearl followed, wiping sleep from her eyes. Kostya whispered that if Ma woke up, she'd give us chores, and if our sisters did, they'd boss us around. Pearl tiptoed upstairs and returned with her shoebox of paper dolls. She brought along a gust of foul-smelling air. You, Kostya said, and Pearl denied it was her, like always. Kostya had found a little Sammy Sneeze comic about a feast, and he slowly read the first panel. He simply couldn't stop it. He never knew when it was coming. The people at the table bowed their heads in prayer, and panel by panel, little Sammy sneezed all the food off the table. He even sneezed the gravy out of the gravy bowl into an old man's beard. Chow, we whispered, giggling. Our doors and windows were closed, yet the smell was so strong that it burned the back of my throat and gagged me. This wasn't my baby sister. At school, we got wind of the men blasting a half-mile underground, and on our way home, we scavenged trash coal, which made a fire that stunk like a dirty diaper. This was worse than those smells, worse than the funk on Pa's dinner pail. Milk splashed out of the top of my bowl, followed by Ma's sugar bowl clattering on the shelf. We thought that was funny, like Sammy's sneeze clearing the gravy out of the gravy bowl. But we were spooked too. My clippings started sliding from the table, and I pinned them with my elbow as the cinnamon shaker toppled over. Yaney, Pearl climbed into my lap. Strings of dried mushrooms and sliced apples rattled against the window, which shook in its frame, and I looked outside where the porch swayed like a ship. Now the kitchen smelled like a forgotten Easter egg, more like a dozen forgotten eggs. I saw snow lift off roofs a few inches and land with a thud, thick sheets of it sliding down. Ma had made it downstairs and was gripping the table edge, her face stretched with pain. This baby's a boat in my belly, she said. Everything's pitching, Kostya squealed. As soon as he said that, a deathly calm settled. Not even a crow cawing. Miss Kelly, our teacher, had just taught us that thunder reaches your ears many seconds after lightning flashes. Same after fireworks, she'd said. After an explosion, I thought, remembering Nadja's warning. My sisters stood on the landing in their nightgowns. What is it? Lethea asked. When she opened her mouth again, I heard thunder, fireworks, a cannon blast, crumpling metal, the earth splitting in two, as if little Sammy Sneeze had sneezed the hillside clear off. 2 booms sounded, followed by sick echoes bouncing to the hill across the way and back. The sugar bowl that had made it through the Thanksgiving brawl leapt off its shelf to shatter on the floor, and broken crockery mixed with spilled sugar at our feet. When the echoes played themselves out, we listened in frightened silence. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. We have books for sale. I'd be happy to sign them to anyone in your life. And I'm delighted that we could do this online too.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for giving the time to come here today. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you everyone for coming.